Miss Marple and the Murder of Inspector Godfrey. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and I'm so glad to have you with us again. Tonight, I'd love to ask you something. What is it that makes you enjoy these cozy mysteries? Share your reason in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. A Visitor with a Notebook. The early September morning had that particular quality of light that comes only in the last days of summer, when the air holds just the faintest hint of autumn's approach. In St. Mary Mead, the village was stirring to its familiar rhythms, though there was something different in the air that Tuesday morning, a sense of subdued excitement that comes when a stranger arrives in a place where strangers are both rare and immediately noteworthy. Miss Jane Marple, tending to her garden in the crisp morning air, had been among the first to notice the arrival of Inspector Reginald Godfrey at the Blue Board the previous evening. Not that she had been watching, of course, merely watering her daisies at the front gate when the taxi had drawn up, and a neat, courteous-looking gentleman had alighted with a single leather case and an air of quiet purpose about him. A county man, she had murmured to herself, recognizing the type immediately. Not local police. Inspector Slack would have mentioned such a visit, if only to grumble about interference from headquarters. No, this gentleman had that particular bearing that comes from dealing with matters beyond the usual run of stolen bicycles and poached rabbits. Now, as she snipped dead heads from her roses with the precise movements of long practice, Miss Marple reflected on the whispers that had already begun to circulate through the village. Mrs. Bantry's cook had it from the Blue Boar's kitchen, made that the gentleman had been most particular about his breakfast, very polite but watchful, with eyes that seemed to take note of everything while giving nothing away. The postmistress, Miss Pike, had mentioned in passing that there had been some talk recently about money. Odd money, she'd said with a meaningful look, the sort that made its way through village shops in ways that didn't bear too close examination. The Walmart church clock was striking 10 when Miss Marple observed Inspector Godfrey emerging from the Blue Boar, a small notebook already in his hand. He paused on the doorstep, surveying the high street with the methodical gaze of a man accustomed to noting details that others might miss. His appearance was everything that his behavior suggested. Tidy without being fussy, well-dressed in a quiet way that spoke of care rather than vanity, with graying hair brushed neatly back, and a mustache that was trimmed with military precision. He began his rounds with the sort of systematic approach that Miss Marple rather admired. First to the post office, where Miss Pike would no doubt be questioned with the greatest courtesy about recent postal activities, then to Mr. Clement's, where the Reverend would be treated to the same polite but thorough attention. By noon, he had visited the bank manager and spoken briefly with Dr. Haydock, always with that notebook at the ready, always with the same courteous manner that somehow managed to be both reassuring and slightly unsettling. It was after lunch that Inspector Godfrey made his way to the various shops along the high street. Miss Marple, who happened to be selecting vegetables at the greengrocer's, could not help but observe his visit to Danks's establishment next door. Cyril Danks, the smooth-mannered draper and haberdasher, emerged from his shop to greet the inspector with perhaps a shade more bonhomie than the occasion strictly warranted. "Good afternoon, Inspector," Danks had said, his voice carrying clearly through the open door. "Lovely weather we're having. I do hope you're finding everything you need in our little village." The inspector's response was characteristically measured. "Indeed, Mr. Danks. I wonder if I might have a word." "Nothing urgent, you understand, but I'm making inquiries about certain financial irregularities, small notes that may have passed through local businesses." Miss Marple, who had developed over the years a remarkable ability to appear completely absorbed in the selection of turnips, while remaining acutely aware of conversations taking place nearby, noted the almost imperceptible tightening around Mr. Danks's eyes before his smile broadened. Of course, of course. Though I'm sure you'll find everything quite in order here. I keep most careful records. I do pride myself on it, actually. I'm certain you do, the inspector had replied. Perhaps we might step inside. Their conversation continued beyond Miss Marple's hearing. But when the inspector emerged 20 minutes later, his notebook was several pages fuller, and his expression had taken on the particular thoughtfulness of a man who has learned something interesting, though not necessarily what he had expected to learn. The afternoon wore on with similar visits to the electrician Fosdyke, who maintained the various meters and electrical fittings throughout the village, and to Frank Lacey, the quiet man who operated a small carrying service between St. Mary Mead and the neighboring villages. Each conversation was conducted with the same scrupulous politeness. Each left the inspector with a few more notes and that same thoughtful expression. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Inspector Godfrey encountered Miss Marple quite by chance, or what passes for chance in a village the size of St. Mary Mead, outside the church gate. They had been introduced the previous evening at the Blue Boar by Mrs. Bantry, who had been dining there, and had characteristically taken it upon herself to ensure that the visiting gentleman was properly welcomed. Miss Marple, the inspector said, touching his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, I wonder if I might impose upon your local knowledge for a moment. Certainly, Inspector, though I'm afraid my knowledge extends mostly to the more domestic aspects of village life. Precisely what I had hoped, he replied, consulting his notebook. I'm investigating certain irregularities involving currency, small denomination notes that appear to have been, shall we say, refreshed before being recirculated. The work is quite skillful, almost artistic in its way. Miss Marple considered this information with the same care she might give to a problem in her garden. How interesting, she said finally. May I ask what sort of refreshing? The notes appear to have been treated to remove certain markings and stains, then restored to a more acceptable appearance before being passed along. The process would require both skill and access to appropriate materials. I see. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her mild blue eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. You know, Inspector, if you were to ask me who in this village might be particularly sensitive to small inconveniences, the sort of person who would notice a stained note or a worn coin, I should be inclined to say that it would be someone who lives by small economies. Indeed, oh yes, people who must count every penny develop a remarkable eye for detail. They notice things that others might overlook, a spot here, a tear there, and of course they also develop quite ingenious methods for dealing with such problems. The inspector made another note. That's most helpful, Miss Marple. Most helpful indeed. It was then that Mrs. Bantry appeared, as she had a habit of doing at precisely the moment when interesting conversations were taking place. Jane, dear, and Inspector Godfrey. How delightful to find you both here. You simply must come back to the house for tea. I've just had the most marvelous seed cake from cook, and I'm dying to hear how your investigation is progressing, Inspector. And so it was that by 5 o'clock the three of them were seated in Mrs. Bantry's comfortable sitting room, where Inspector Godfrey found himself expanding on his inquiries over excellent tea and what was indeed a remarkable seed cake. The curious thing, he was saying, is that the work appears to be quite recent. Within the past few weeks, I should say. Someone has been very busy and very careful. How many notes would you estimate? Miss Marple inquired, refilling his cup with the practiced movements of a lifelong hostess. Perhaps 30 or 40. Not an enormous sum, but significant enough. Each one shows the same careful treatment, cleaned, pressed, the damaged areas somehow restored. Quite professional work, really. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with interest. And you think someone in St. Mary Mead is responsible? The notes have all passed through local businesses within the past month. Someone with access to various shops and services, I should think. Someone who could introduce the refreshed currency gradually without drawing attention. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a gentle clink. I wonder, Inspector, if you've given any thought to the pressing and cleaning aspect of the process. That would require quite specific equipment, wouldn't it? Indeed it would. I've been giving considerable thought to that very question. He glanced at his watch, a neat gold timepiece that caught the late afternoon light. In fact, I've arranged to visit Mrs. Pilbeam's establishment this evening. She runs the local laundry, and I understand she has quite modern equipment, rollers, pressing machines, and so forth. Mrs. Pilbeam is most reliable, Miss Marple observed. A practical woman, very capable. Her niece Iris assists her, a sweet girl, though perhaps a bit flighty. Iris, the inspector made another note, Mrs. Pilbeam's niece. She's quite skilled at the finer work, ironing, pressing delicate items. She has such neat hands. The inspector finished his tea and consulted his watch once more. I should be going shortly. I've arranged to meet Mrs. Pilbeam at 6:15 to examine Monday's callers and look over her cash book. She seemed quite willing to cooperate. She would be, Mrs. Bantry observed. Ada Pilbeam is as honest as the day is long. If there's any irregular money passing through her establishment, she'll be the first to want it sorted out. As Inspector Godfrey took his leave, thanking them both for their hospitality and their insights, Miss Marple remained thoughtfully silent. Only after his footsteps had faded down the garden path did she speak. Dolly, dear, did you notice anything particular about the inspector's questions? He seemed quite thorough, I thought. Very methodical. Yes, indeed. But I couldn't help thinking that he's already formed certain ideas about what he might find. A careful man, our Inspector Godfrey, but perhaps not quite as careful as he believes himself to be. Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. Whatever do you mean, Jane? But Miss Marple had already risen and was gathering her knitting. Oh, probably nothing at all, dear. Just an old woman's fancies, though. I think I shall take a walk past Beams this evening. Such a lovely evening for a stroll, don't you think? As she made her way home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the inspector's methodical approach and his evident competence. He was clearly an experienced man, accustomed to unraveling complex schemes involving money and deception. But there was something in his manner that suggested he had already begun to focus on particular possibilities, particular people. In Miss Marple's long experience, that could sometimes be a dangerous thing. Chapter 2. Laundry at Dusk, the Eye. September evening light was fading to that particular amber quality that seems to transform the most commonplace scenes into something almost theatrical when the cry first rang out from Pilbeam's laundry. It was 25 minutes past 6 by the church clock, and most of the village was settling into the comfortable routines of early evening, the drawing of curtains, the lighting of lamps, the general air of domestic tranquility that marked the end of another unremarkable day in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bantry, as it happened, was arranging late roses in her morning room when the shout reached her through the open window. It came from the direction of the lane behind the high street, where Mrs. Pilbeam's establishment occupied a converted cottage that had served the village's laundering needs for the better part of 20 years. The cry was sharp, urgent, and unmistakably alarmed, the sort of sound that cuts through evening calm like a knife through silk. Within moments, the various inhabitants of the nearby houses had emerged from their doors with that peculiar mixture of curiosity and reluctance that characterizes the English response to neighborhood disturbances. Mrs. Bantry herself, still clutching a half-arranged stem of Damascus rose, hurried toward the lane with a determined stride of someone who had never yet encountered a crisis she could not somehow organize into manageable proportions. She arrived to find a small cluster of villagers already gathered outside the laundry's modest entrance. The door stood wide open, spilling yellow light onto the cobbled path, and from within came the sound of Dr. Haydock's authoritative voice, directing someone, presumably Mrs. Pilbeam, to sit down. "My dear woman, put your head between your knees." "Whatever has happened?" Mrs. Bantry demanded, addressing herself to Mr. Fosdyke, who stood nearest the doorway with the peculiar expression of a man who had seen something he would greatly prefer to unsee. "It's that inspector fellow," Fosdyke replied, his usually steady voice carrying an uncharacteristic tremor. "Found him in the back room, caught up in the mangle. Something dreadful. Mrs. Pilbeam's in a terrible state." "Poor woman," Mrs. Bantry pushed past the small crowd with characteristic determination, pausing only when Dr. Haydock's firm hand appeared on her shoulder. "I shouldn't go in there just yet, Dolly," he said quietly. "Not a pleasant sight, I'm afraid. The man appears to have been caught in the machinery. His scarf and collar have gone through the rollers. Quite beyond help, I'm sorry to say." From within the building came the sound of Mrs. Pilbeam's voice, high and shaking. "I left it off, I did. I always leave the mangle off when I'm finished. The safety bar was loose, just as it should be. If anything thick goes in, she pops right up. She does. I don't understand it. I don't understand it at all." It was at this moment that Miss Marple appeared at Mrs. Bantry's elbow, having approached with that silent efficiency she had perfected over decades of arriving precisely when and where she was most needed. She surveyed the scene with eyes that missed nothing. The shocked faces, the open door spilling its harsh light, the sound of distress from within. "How dreadful," she murmured. "The poor man, and poor Mrs. Pilbeam, of course. Such a terrible shock for her. Dr. Haydock," she added in a questioning tone. "Miss Marple," he replied, turning. "Yes, indeed, most distressing. I've sent young Clement to telephone Inspector Slack. This will need to be reported officially, of course. Appears to be a tragic accident, but these things must be done properly." "Naturally," Miss Marple said. Her gaze had shifted to the cottage's windows, where the warm glow of electric lights revealed the orderly interior of a working laundry. "Might one ask what exactly has occurred?" "From what I can determine," Dr. Haydock replied, lowering his voice, "the inspector was examining something in the back room when he somehow became entangled in the powered mangle, his scarf caught in the rollers, and once that happened," he shrugged expressively. "But surely there are safety measures?" Mrs. Bantry inquired. "I mean, one hears of such things, but modern machinery—" "Indeed, there are. Mrs. Pilbeam is quite adamant that she left the safety bar in its proper position and the power switch turned off. She says she always does so. Yet when she returned from some errands, she found the machinery running and the poor fellow—" He gestured toward the interior. Miss Marple absorbed this information with a quiet attention she might have given to a particularly complex knitting pattern. "When was this exactly, Doctor?" "She discovered him at approximately 6:35. Says she had been out for perhaps a quarter of an hour. No more. Left the inspector examining some collars and looking through her account books." "I see. And the young lady, Miss Iris, isn't it? Wasn't here when it happened?" "Had gone on some errand to Danks's shop." "I understand. Fortunate for her. Would have been a terrible shock for such a young person." At this point, Inspector Slack arrived with his customary air of harassed efficiency, having covered the distance from the police station in what must have been record time. He surveyed the assembled crowd with obvious displeasure. "Right then, everyone back, if you please. This is police business now." He turned to Dr. Haydock. "What's the situation, Doctor?" Haydock provided a concise summary while Slack made notes in his official notebook. A larger, more official-looking volume than the neat leather-bound book that Inspector Godfrey had carried. As he spoke, the sound of Mrs. Pilbeam's distress gradually subsided, replaced by the sort of shocked silence that follows in the wake of sudden tragedy. "Accident, you think?" Slack inquired when the doctor had finished. Difficult to see what else it could be. The machinery was running when Mrs. Pilbeam discovered him. The safety mechanisms had somehow failed, and the poor fellow was caught up in the rollers. Death would have been quite rapid, a combination of the initial blow and strangulation. Mercifully quick, at least, Slack nodded grimly. These old machines can be treacherous. Seen similar cases in the industrial areas. Fellow leans in to examine something, gets caught up, and that's the end of it. He glanced around the assembled villagers. "I'll need statements from everyone, of course. Mrs. Pilbeam first, then whoever else was in the vicinity." It was then that Miss Marple stepped forward with the diffident manner she employed when she wished to seem particularly harmless and unimportant. "Inspector Slack, I do hope you won't think me presumptuous, but might I perhaps take a quick look inside? I have some small experience with laundry machinery, and I should be most interested to understand exactly what occurred." Slack regarded her with the weary expression of a man who had learned through sometimes painful experience that Miss Marple's requests were seldom as innocent as they appeared. However, her reputation for occasional usefulness in matters of this sort had grown considerably over recent years. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in it, provided you don't disturb anything. Doctor, would you accompany Miss Marple? I need to get organized statements from the others." And so it was that Miss Marple found herself stepping across the threshold of Pilbeam's laundry in the company of Dr. Haydock, her mild eyes taking in every detail of the scene that had so recently been the site of Inspector Godfrey's final investigation. The front room of the cottage served as the business area, a counter where customers brought their items, shelves lined with neat bundles awaiting collection, and the general air of organized efficiency that characterized Mrs. Pilbeam's approach to her trade. Beyond this lay the working area, where the actual business of washing, pressing, and drying took place. It was in this back room that the tragedy had occurred. The space was warm and steamy, filled with the clean scent of soap and starch that one might expect in such an establishment. Against one wall stood the mangle, itself a substantial piece of equipment, with heavy rollers designed to press moisture from damp clothing. The machine was now silent, but the evidence of its recent operation was unmistakably present. Inspector Godfrey's body had been moved to one side, covered decently with a clean sheet that Dr. Haydock had procured. The mangle's rollers bore witness to the struggle that had occurred, fabric from the inspector's scarf and collar wound around the mechanism, now stained with more than soap and water. "Poor fellow," Dr. Haydock murmured. "Must have been examining something close to the machine when his scarf caught." Once that happened, the rest was inevitable. Miss Marple moved carefully around the room, her eyes cataloging details with the methodical precision of someone who had learned over many years that the most significant clues are often the smallest and most easily overlooked. She noted the position of the machine's controls, the arrangement of various implements and supplies, the general orderliness that spoke of Mrs. Pilbeam's conscientious approach to her work. It was as she approached the wall-mounted prepayment meter that controlled the machine's electrical supply that she paused, her attention caught by something that glittered faintly in the harsh electric light. "Doctor," she said quietly, "might I trouble you to look at something?" Dr. Haydock joined her beside the meter, following her gaze to the small coin tray beneath the device. There, among the usual collection of pennies and sixpences that fed such machines, lay a single shilling that caught the light in an unusual way. Miss Marple leaned closer, her expression growing thoughtful. "How curious," she murmured, then turned her attention to the area immediately beneath the mangle. There, wedged neatly under the safety bar that should have prevented exactly the sort of accident that had befallen Inspector Godfrey, was a small piece of stiff cardboard, the sort used to maintain the shape of detachable collars. Most interesting, she continued, then moved to examine the machine's control lever. Doctor, would you say that these marks here appear recent to you? Dr. Haydock bent to examine the lever where Miss Marple indicated. Faint but visible against the painted surface were what appeared to be adhesive marks, as though something had been attached to hold the control in a particular position. By Jove, he said softly. You may be on to something, Miss Marple. This wasn't an accident at all, was it? Miss Marple straightened, her gentle features wearing the expression of quiet satisfaction that those who knew her had learned to associate with the solution of particularly puzzling problems. I rather think not, Doctor. I rather think Inspector Godfrey was quite deliberately murdered. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices wax on a shilling. The peculiar quality of the shilling became more apparent once Inspector Slack had been summoned to examine Miss Marple's discovery. He approached the prepayment meter with the skeptical air of a man who had learned to be cautious about seemingly innocent observations from elderly spinsters, particularly this elderly spinster, whose previous contributions to his investigations had proven to be both invaluable and deeply irritating in equal measure. Well then, Miss Marple, he said, consulting his notebook with deliberate officiousness, what exactly am I supposed to be looking at? Miss Marple indicated the coin tray with a gentle gesture that somehow managed to convey both deference and absolute certainty. The shilling. Inspector, if you would be so kind as to examine it closely, but perhaps without removing it just yet. Slack bent closer, his expression shifting from dutiful attention to genuine interest as he observed the coin in question. Unlike its companions in the tray, this particular shilling caught the electric light in an unusual manner, its surface bearing what appeared to be a thin, greasy film along one edge. Looks like someone's been handling it with dirty fingers, he observed, though his tone suggested he suspected there might be more to it than that. Precisely what I thought initially, Miss Marple agreed. But if you were to smell it, Inspector, I believe you might find the scent rather distinctive. Dr. Haydock, who had been observing this exchange with growing fascination, leaned forward. May I? At Slack's grudging nod, the doctor carefully lifted the coin and held it near his nose. His eyebrows rose immediately. Paraffin wax, he announced. Definitely paraffin wax, and recently applied, I should say. Wax? Slack's tone sharpened with interest. What would someone want to put wax on a shilling for? Miss Marple moved to examine the meter's coin slot more closely, her movements precise and economical. I believe, Inspector, that if one were to wedge a coin with soft wax, particularly a coin that was slightly too large for the slot, one might be able to make it hang there temporarily. The wax would hold it in position until warmth caused it to soften, allowing the coin to drop when one wished, rather than when one inserted it. You mean someone could delay the machine starting? Exactly. So the current would only flow when the coin finally fell, which could be considerably after the person who placed it there had departed. Slack absorbed this information. With the grudging respect he had learned to accord Miss Marple's mechanical insights. Right. So someone could set this up to run later, then establish an alibi elsewhere. That would be my interpretation. Exactly. Dr. Haydock had moved to examine other aspects of the room while this conversation proceeded. Miss Marple, he called from near the ironing board. You might find this interesting as well. She joined him beside the substantial wooden board where Mrs. Pilbeam's pressing work was performed. The surface bore the typical signs of regular use: slight burns and discoloration from hot irons, small scorch marks where items had been pressed at high temperatures. But in one area, the pattern was distinctly different. Grid marks, Dr. Haydock observed, indicating a section where the wood showed a cross-hatched pattern of burns, rather as though a very hot iron had been left standing here for some time. An iron left on its face, Miss Marple mused, running a finger lightly across the pattern. Most unusual. Any competent laundress would know better than to leave a hot iron in such a position. It damages both the iron and the board. Inspector Slack had joined them, his interest clearly engaged now despite his initial skepticism. So what are you suggesting, that someone deliberately left a hot iron here? It would seem so, Miss Marple replied. And if one considers the position directly adjacent to the wall where the meter is mounted, one might reasonably conclude that the heat was intended to warm that section of wall, to soften the wax on the shilling. Make it drop at just the right moment, Slack concluded with growing excitement. That would be my supposition. Inspector? Miss Marple had continued her methodical examination of the room while speaking, her keen eyes noting details that spoke to the careful preparation that must have preceded the evening's tragedy. Near the meter, a shelf held various supplies essential to the laundry business, bottles of bluing, packets of starch, and the small ink pad used to stamp bundle tickets with collection numbers. It was while examining these items that she made her next discovery. Blue bag, the sort used for whitening linens, sat among the supplies, but its position struck her as somehow wrong. She had observed Mrs. Pilbeam's work methods on previous occasions and knew her to be a woman of precise habits. Inspector, she said quietly, might I draw your attention to something else? Slack approached with the weary patience of a man who had learned that Miss Marple's observations invariably led somewhere significant, however unlikely they might initially appear. This blue bag, she indicated. I believe Mrs. Pilbeam mentioned that she always keeps such things in specific locations. This one appears to be sitting very close to the ink pad. What of it? Well, if one were handling items that had been treated with ink, banknotes, for instance, one might inadvertently transfer traces of that ink to other objects. And if one were using blue and starch to treat those notes, one might find the blue bag displaced from its usual position. She moved closer to examine Inspector Godfrey's body, now covered with the sheet Dr. Haydock had provided. Doctor, might you assist me for a moment? With careful precision, they lifted the edge of the sheet to examine the inspector's hands. His right glove bore a tiny smear of green, barely visible, but unmistakably present. Banknote ink, Dr. Haydock observed, fresh by the looks of it. Indeed. And if one were to examine the Mangle's rollers more closely... Miss Marple approached the silent machine, peering at the felt-covered rollers that had so recently been the instrument of Inspector Godfrey's death. In the harsh electric light, a faint dusting of green was just visible on the fabric surface, so slight as to be nearly invisible, but present nonetheless. The poor man discovered the method, she said softly. Someone has been using this equipment to process damaged banknotes, washing them with blue, pressing them flat and dry with the mangle, restoring them to a condition where they could be passed as legitimate currency. Inspector Slack was making rapid notes. His skepticism entirely evaporated now, and Godfrey stumbled onto the operation. More than that, I believe. He arranged to examine the evidence this evening, the collars from Monday's work, the cash book, presumably looking for traces of the processed notes. Someone could not afford to let him complete that examination, so they rigged the machinery to kill him. Precisely. A delayed action murder, Inspector. The killer needed only to prepare the scene, then establish themselves elsewhere when the mechanism activated. Dr. Haydock shook his head in amazement. Devilishly clever in a twisted sort of way, but surely it required considerable knowledge of the equipment. Indeed it did. This was not the work of someone unfamiliar with the machinery's operation. The safety mechanisms had to be defeated, the timing calculated precisely, and the victim's presence in the room at the critical moment ensured. Miss Marple moved back to examine the area around the mangle's controls more carefully. "Inspector, if you would observe the control lever itself." Slack bent to look where she indicated. "More marks," he noted. "Looks like something was tied around it. Thread, I should think. White thread, judging from the few fibers still caught here. The lever has been held in the on position by some sort of binding that was later removed after the victim was dead." "Exactly." As we can see, the room fell silent for a moment as the three of them contemplated the calculated nature of the crime. This had been no impulsive act of violence, but a carefully planned murder designed to appear as an unfortunate accident. "The question now," Inspector Slack said grimly, "is who in this village had both the knowledge to devise such a scheme and the motive to want Inspector Godfrey dead?" Miss Marple adjusted her knitting bag with the air of someone settling in for a long and complex investigation. "I believe, Inspector, that we shall find the answer lies in determining exactly who had access to the materials used in this deception: paraffin wax, white thread, knowledge of electrical meters, and familiarity with laundry equipment. Quite a specific combination of requirements." "Right then," Slack declared, closing his notebook with a snap. "Time to start asking some very pointed questions, beginning with Mrs. Pilbeam, and working our way through everyone who's been in this building recently." As they prepared to leave the scene, Miss Marple took one last look around the room where Inspector Godfrey had met his carefully orchestrated end. The machinery sat silent now, but the evidence of its deadly purpose remained clear to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Someone in St. Mary Mead was a very clever and very dangerous killer. Chapter 4: The Safety Bar That Didn't Lift. The morning light, streaming through the laundry windows, revealed details that had been less apparent in the harsh electric illumination of the previous evening. Miss Marple had returned early, accompanied by Inspector Slack, who had spent a restless night contemplating the implications of what they had discovered. The transformation of what had appeared to be a tragic accident into a calculated murder had unsettled him considerably, and he was eager to pursue every avenue of investigation with the thoroughness that such a serious matter demanded. Mrs. Pilbeam, though still pale and shaken from the previous evening's events, had insisted on being present during this more detailed examination. She sat on a wooden chair near the front counter, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching with anxious eyes as the investigation proceeded. "I still can't fathom it," she said for perhaps the 12th time. "That safety bar has never failed me, not once in 15 years of operation. When something thick goes through, a towel folded double, a gentleman's collar that's been poorly arranged, up she pops, quick as anything, and the rollers stop turning." Miss Marple approached the mangle with the measured steps of someone conducting a careful experiment. The machine stood silent now, its rollers bearing mute testimony to the previous evening's tragedy. She bent to examine the safety mechanism more closely, her fingers tracing the metal bar that should have prevented precisely the sort of accident that had befallen Inspector Godfrey. "Mrs. Pilbeam," she said thoughtfully, "might you demonstrate for us exactly how this safety device operates under normal circumstances?" Mrs. Pilbeam rose somewhat unsteadily and joined Miss Marple beside the machine. "Well, you see, when I feed something through, a shirt, say, or table linen, the fabric passes between these rollers here. But if something too thick tries to go through, or if fabric bunches up wrong, this bar here lifts up automatic-like. And that stops the whole mechanism." She indicated the metal safety bar with a gesture that spoke of long familiarity. "It's weighted, you see. Any pressure from below and up she goes. Simple but reliable." Miss Marple nodded, then bent closer to examine the area beneath the bar. "How curious," she murmured. "Inspector, might you look at this?" Slack joined her, peering at the mechanism with the concentrated attention of a man who had learned to trust Miss Marple's observations. however unlikely they might initially appear. There appears to be something wedged beneath the fulcrum point, Miss Marple observed. Something that would prevent the bar from lifting regardless of the pressure applied to it. With careful precision, she extracted a small piece of stiff material from where it had been inserted beneath the safety mechanism. It was a collar stiffener, the sort of cardboard insert used to maintain the shape of detachable collars, but this one had been treated with something that made its surface slick and smooth. Starch, she announced after examining it closely. This has been coated with starch paste, which would allow it to slide easily into position and hold firmly once placed. Inspector Slack accepted the stiffener and examined it with growing excitement. So, someone deliberately sabotaged the safety mechanism, wedged this thing in so the bar couldn't lift when Godfrey's scarf caught in the rollers? That would appear to be the case. Inspector, Mrs. Pilbeam had gone even paler if such a thing were possible. But who would know to do such a thing? Who would understand how the mechanism works well enough to defeat it so cleverly? It was an excellent question, and one that Miss Marple pondered as she continued her examination of the machine's various controls and mechanisms. The level of mechanical knowledge required to devise such a scheme was considerable, not something that could be accomplished by someone with only a casual acquaintance with laundry equipment. Inspector, she said after a moment, might we examine the control lever once more? I believe there may be additional evidence there. They moved to the electrical controls, where the switch that governed the machine's operation showed clear signs of tampering. In daylight, the marks that had been barely visible the previous evening were now quite apparent. Tape marks, Slack observed. Someone bound the switch in the on position. Indeed. But observe the nature of the adhesive residue. It has a particular quality that suggests a specific type of tape or binding material. Miss Marple produced a small magnifying glass from her knitting bag, an implement that had proven useful in previous investigations, and examined the switch mechanism closely. There are fibers caught here as well, she noted. White fibers, very fine thread, I should think, the same thread used to hold the switch. Very likely. And if we examine the back of the switch housing, she maneuvered her magnifying glass to observe the rear of the control mechanism. Yes, indeed. There are traces of what appears to be shellac here as well. Shellac? A type of varnish, Inspector, often used by those who work with wood or need to create a firm, lasting bond. It dries quickly and holds securely. Mrs. Pilbeam looked puzzled. I don't keep shellac here, Miss Marple. Have no use for such things in a laundry. No, indeed. This would have been brought here specifically for this purpose. Miss Marple straightened, her expression thoughtful. Someone prepared very carefully for this crime. They brought specific materials: the paraffin wax for the coin, starch for the collar stiffener, white thread, and shellac for securing the switch. This was not an improvised scheme. Inspector Slack was making detailed notes. So we're looking for someone with access to all these materials. That should narrow the field considerably. One would think so, though I suspect we may find that several people in the village have access to such commonplace items when taken individually. Miss Marple had moved to examine the area around the machine more broadly, her eyes cataloging every detail that might prove significant. It was then that she noticed something that made her pause. Inspector, there is something else here that may interest you. She was looking at the floor near the mangle's base, where a short length of white thread lay partially concealed beneath the machinery. This thread differed from the fibers caught on the switch. It was longer, perhaps 3 inches in length, and showed clear signs of having been treated with some sort of adhesive substance. This appears to be a piece of the thread used to secure the switch, she observed. But notice that one end bears traces of that shellac we observed earlier. It seems our killer was not quite as thorough in cleaning up as they believed. Slack carefully collected the thread, wrapping it in his handkerchief for later examination. Evidence is mounting up nicely, he observed with satisfaction. Between the wax, the stiffener, and now this thread, we're building quite a case indeed. Though we must still determine who had both the knowledge to devise such a scheme and the opportunity to implement it. Mrs. Pilbeam had been listening to this exchange with growing distress. To think that someone used my own equipment for such a wicked purpose, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Poor Inspector Godfrey, coming here on official business and meeting such a dreadful end. Miss Marple regarded the distraught woman with sympathy. Mrs. Pilbeam, I wonder if you might help us understand who would be familiar enough with your equipment to know exactly how to disable the safety mechanisms. Well, there's my Iris, of course, though she's far too gentle a soul for such wickedness. Mr. Fosdyke services the electrical connections and motors. He'd know about the switch mechanism, I suppose. And naturally, anyone who's worked with similar equipment elsewhere might understand the principles. What about your customers? Anyone who's shown particular interest in how the machinery operates? Mrs. Pilbeam considered this carefully. Not really, Miss Marple. Most folks just bring their items and collect them when they're ready. Though... She paused, frowning slightly. Mr. Danks has been quite curious about our methods lately, asked several questions about how we achieved such good results with stained items. This information caused both Miss Marple and Inspector Slack to exchange meaningful glances. Cyril Danks, the smooth-mannered draper, had already emerged as someone with potential connections to the banknote scheme that Inspector Godfrey had been investigating. When did Mr. Danks show this interest? Oh, within the past few weeks, I should say. Mentioned that some of his customers had commented on the quality of our pressing work, wanted to know our methods for dealing with particularly stubborn stains and such. I see. And did you explain your procedures to him? Well, yes. He seemed genuinely interested, and there's no secret to honest work. I showed him how the mangle operates, explained about the safety mechanisms and the electrical controls. Professional courtesy, you might say. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with an air of grim satisfaction. Right then, I think it's time we had another conversation with Mr. Cyril Danks, and this time we'll be asking rather more pointed questions about his recent interest in laundry procedures as they prepared to leave Pilbeam's establishment. Miss Marple took one final look around the scene where such careful preparations had been made for murder. The evidence was accumulating steadily, painting a picture of premeditation that was both shocking in its cold calculation and impressive in its mechanical ingenuity. Quite diabolical. Really, she murmured to Inspector Slack, to use a person's own professional equipment against them in such a manner. Indeed. But clever as our killer thinks he is, he's left us quite a trail to follow. Miss Marple adjusted her knitting bag and prepared to continue what promised to be a most illuminating investigation. Chapter 5. Blue Bag in the Wrong Tub. The interview with young Iris Pilbeam proved to be both illuminating and distressing, though perhaps not in the ways that Inspector Slack had anticipated. The girl had returned to the laundry that morning in a state of barely controlled agitation, her usually neat appearance somewhat disheveled, and her eyes reddened from what had clearly been a sleepless night. Miss Marple, observing the young woman's distress with a compassionate eye of someone who had witnessed many such scenes over the years, suggested that they might conduct their conversation in the relative comfort of the front room, rather than in the scene of the previous evening's tragedy. Now then, my dear, she said gently, settling herself in a chair where she could observe both Iris and the working area beyond. I know this has been a terrible shock for you. We shall try to make this as brief as possible. Iris nodded gratefully, though her hands continued to twist nervously in her lap. It's just so dreadful, Miss Marple, to think that poor gentleman met such an end here in our own workplace. And Aunt Ada is beside herself with worry about what people will think." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with official precision. "Miss Pilbeam, I need to establish your movements yesterday evening. When did you last see Inspector Godfrey alive?" "It was just past 6 o'clock, Inspector. He had been examining some of Monday's collar work. We keep the gentleman's items separate, you understand, and looking through our account books. Very thorough he was, but polite with it. And then, well, he asked Aunt Ada about the cash receipts, and she went to fetch the strong box from the office. That's when I mentioned that I needed to step out for a few minutes. There was a ribbon on Aunt's adding machine that had become tangled, and Mr. Danks had said he could replace it quick as anything." Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this detail. "Mr. Danks specifically offered to replace the ribbon?" "Oh, yes, Miss Marple. Very kind of him it was. He'd noticed the problem when he was here earlier in the week, asking about our pressing methods. Said he had just the right sort of ribbon in his shop and would be happy to fit it properly." Inspector Slack made a note. "What time did you leave for Danks's shop?" 10 minutes past 6 by the clock in our front room. I remember particularly because I wanted to be back before. We usually close up around then, you see." "And how long did this errand take?" Iris's brow furrowed in concentration. "Well, Mr. Danks was very particular about fitting the ribbon correctly. Said it was important to get the tension just right, or the figures wouldn't print clearly. I should say I was there the better part of 20 minutes, until 6:30. "Then just pasted Inspector? Perhaps 6:32 or 6:33. Mr. Danks?" Walked me to the door and remarked, "On what a pleasant evening it was." Miss Marple had been listening to this exchange while simultaneously observing the laundry's working area with a careful attention she habitually paid to domestic arrangements. It was during Iris's recounting of her visit to the draper's shop that something caught her eye, a detail so small that anyone less observant might have missed it entirely. "Iris, my dear," she interjected gently, "I wonder if you might help me understand something about your aunt's working methods. When you left yesterday evening, where exactly had you placed the blue bag?" "The blue bag, Miss Marple. The bag of bluing powder for whitening linens. I noticed there's one sitting near the starch pan, but I have the impression it might not be in its usual location." Iris rose and moved to examine the area Miss Marple indicated. "Oh, that's quite wrong," she said immediately. "I always leave the blue bag in the spa tub when we're finished for the day. It's handier there for the next morning's work. I certainly didn't put it by the starch." "You're quite certain of this?" "Absolutely, Miss Marple. It's been my routine for 2 years now. Aunt Ada is very particular about keeping everything in its proper place." Inspector Slack looked up from his notes. "So someone moved the blue bag after you left?" "It would seem so, Inspector." Miss Marple had moved to examine the spa tub, the large basin used for rinsing items after washing. "And what do we find here instead?" she murmured, peering into the tub's depths. "A gentleman's collar, I believe, but one that appears to be missing something." She carefully lifted the collar from the tub, holding it up to the light. "Iris, would you say this collar is complete?" The young woman examined the item with the practiced eye of someone familiar with such work. "No, Miss Marple, it's not. The stiffener's been removed. You can see where it was, by the way. The fabric holds its shape in some places, but not others." "Indeed. And when would a stiffener typically be removed?" "Well, before washing, usually. The cardboard ones don't take well to water, but this collar's already been cleaned and pressed. You can tell by the finish. Very strange to remove the stiffener after the work's been done." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. The collar stiffener, wedged beneath the mangle safety bar, had come from somewhere, and this collar with its missing insert provided a likely source. "Iris," she continued, "might you tell us when your aunt last purchased stiffeners? I imagine there are a regular necessity in this business." Oh, yes, we go through quite a few. Let me think. She paused, clearly making an effort to recall the details. It was just last week, actually. Mr. Danks sold Aunt Ada a packet, said they were of particularly good quality, and would hold their shape better than the usual sort. Mr. Danks again, Inspector Slack observed grimly. He's very helpful with our supplies, Iris explained, always ready with advice about the best materials for different purposes. He mentioned that these particular stiffeners were excellent for precision work, said they could be trimmed or shaped easily if needed. Miss Marple had returned her attention to the misplaced blue bag, examining it closely for any traces that might prove significant. Inspector, might you observe the edge of this bag? There appears to be a slight discoloration here. Slack joined her in examining the small cloth bag that contained the bluing powder. Along one seam, barely visible against the white fabric, was a faint greenish smear. Banknote ink again, he observed. Same as we found on Godfrey's glove. Precisely. Someone has been handling both this bag and treated currency. The bag has been moved from its proper location and bears traces of the very substance Inspector Godfrey was investigating. The implications were becoming increasingly clear. The blue bag, normally used for whitening fabrics, had evidently played a role in the process of cleaning and restoring damaged banknotes. Its displacement from the spa tub to the starch pan suggested hurried concealment of evidence. Miss Pilbeam, Inspector Slack said, his tone growing more formal, I need to ask you directly. Have you observed anyone else handling your aunt's equipment or supplies recently? Iris shook her head emphatically. No one but family and our regular customers. Inspector, though, she hesitated, clearly reluctant to speak ill of anyone. Please continue, Miss Marple encouraged gently. Well, Mr. Danks has been quite interested in our methods lately. Asked several questions about how we achieved such good results with stained items. Even wondered about our chemical supplies, the blue, the starch, and such. When was this? During his visits over the past few weeks, he seemed particularly curious about items that had been damaged by ink or other staining substances. Said some of his customers had inquired about restoration services. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with an air of grim satisfaction. Right then, time for another conversation with Mr. Cyril Danks, and this time we'll be asking about more than just ribbon replacements. As they prepared to leave the laundry, Miss Marple took a final look around the scene where so much careful deception had taken place. The evidence was mounting steadily, each misplaced item, each trace of foreign substance, each deviation from normal routine pointing toward the same conclusion. Inspector, she said thoughtfully, I believe we may also wish to inquire about recent postal activities. If Mr. Danks has indeed been processing damaged currency, he would need some method of disposing of the restored notes. Good thinking. We'll check with Miss Pike about any unusual mailings, particularly parcels to Reading, Miss Marple added. I believe Inspector Godfrey mentioned that destination in connection with his investigation. As they stepped into the morning sunshine, leaving behind the scene of such calculated malice, Miss Marple reflected on the growing pattern of evidence. Someone had been very clever indeed, but not quite clever enough to eliminate every trace of their activities. The truth, as it so often did, was beginning to emerge from the careful observation of small details and domestic disruptions. Chapter 6. 2 Slips. 1 Bundle. The examination of Mrs. Pilbeam's record-keeping proved to be a revelation in more ways than one. Her system, though simple, was maintained with the sort of methodical precision that comes from years of handling other people's valuable possessions. Each bundle of laundry received a numbered ticket, with a duplicate retained for the establishment's records, creating a paper trail that would have done credit to a much larger commercial enterprise inspector. Slack spread the collection of bundle slips across the counter in the front room, arranging them in chronological order. While Miss Marple observed his work with a quiet attention, she habitually paid to documentary evidence. Mrs. Pilbeam hovered nearby, still visibly shaken by the events of the previous evening, but determined to assist in whatever way she could. "Now then, Mrs. Pilbeam," Slack began, consulting his notebook, "these are all the tickets for Monday's work." "That's right, Inspector. We don't get enormous quantities, you understand, but we pride ourselves on careful handling. Every item gets its proper documentation." Miss Marple had moved closer to examine the slips more carefully. "Might I observe something rather curious here, Inspector?" Slack looked up from his arrangement. "What's that, Miss Marple?" "These two slips appear to be for the same bundle, yet they show different handwriting. This one is in what I take to be Iris's neat script, while this other bears writing that seems altogether different." Mrs. Pilbeam leaned forward to examine the tickets in question. "Well, that is strange. Iris always writes out the tickets for the gentlemen's items. She has such a clear hand. But this second one?" She frowned, clearly puzzled. "The writing is not familiar to me." "More than that," Miss Marple continued, producing her magnifying glass. "This second slip shows signs of alteration. The date has been changed. You can see where the original ink has been partially erased and new figures written over it in pencil." Inspector Slack took the slip and examined it closely. "You're right. Someone's changed the date, from what looks like Tuesday to Monday. And there's something else." He held the ticket up to the window where the natural light revealed additional details. "There's a faint stain along the edge here, greenish, like the traces we found elsewhere. Banknote ink." "Again," Miss Marple observed. "Someone with stained fingers handled this ticket after the alteration was made. The implications were becoming clear. Someone had created a false record of work supposedly done on Monday, work that would have provided cover for the processing of damaged banknotes through the equipment." It was at this moment that Frank Lacey appeared at the shop door, his usually quiet demeanor somewhat agitated. The carrier's arrival was opportune, as Inspector Slack had been hoping to speak with him about his deliveries on the previous evening. "Begging your pardon," Frank said, removing his cap with old-fashioned courtesy. "But I heard about the terrible accident. Thought I should mention that I saw the poor gentleman yesterday just before—" "Please, Mr. Lacey," Miss Marple encouraged. "Do come in. We're very interested in anything you might have observed." Frank entered hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with being questioned about official matters, but equally clearly concerned about doing his civic duty. "Well, it's like this. I brought a late bundle round at 5 minutes past 6, special delivery from Much Benham. Gentleman there needed his collars back like—" "And you saw Inspector Godfrey?" "I did, Miss Marple. He was at the door with his notebook open, asking Mrs. Pilbeam questions about her records." "Very thorough gentleman, he seemed?" Inspector Slack looked up with interest. "This late bundle, was it properly documented?" "Oh, yes, Inspector. Always do things proper, I do. Bundle was tied with good, strong string, white cord with a red thread running through it. Distinctive stuff. Get it from Mr. Danks's shop, I do. He recommended it special for bundles that need to travel." Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged meaningful glances. "Mr. Danks recommended this particular string?" "That's right. Miss Marple said it was stronger than the usual sort and would hold better if bundles got knocked about during transport. Been using it for several weeks now." "And this bundle you delivered yesterday evening? Was it tied with the same string?" Frank nodded emphatically. "Neat as you please. Whoever prepared it knew how to tie a proper, secure knot. Professional work, I'd say." Mrs. Pilbeam had been listening to this exchange with growing confusion. "But Frank, we didn't send anything to Much Benham yesterday. Our last delivery there was Friday last." The carrier's weathered face showed genuine bewilderment. But the bundle came from there, Mrs. Pilbeam. Gentleman said it was laundry being returned after some special treatment. Had all the proper documentation. What sort of documentation? Bundle slip, just like always. Showed it was work done here on Monday, ready for collection. Seemed all in order to me. Miss Marple had returned to examining the duplicate slips spread across the counter. Mr. Lacey, might you look at these tickets and tell us if any appear familiar? Frank approached the counter and studied the various slips with the careful attention of a man accustomed to matching documentation with deliveries. After a moment, he pointed to the altered ticket that had caught Miss Marple's attention. "That's the one," he said with certainty. "I remember because the writing looked a bit different from usual, but the number was correct and everything seemed proper. So, someone created false documentation to justify this late delivery," Inspector Slack concluded grimly. "Someone who wanted to establish a reason for Inspector Godfrey to be in the laundry at precisely the right time." "It would appear so, Inspector. The bundle provided the excuse for the meeting, while the false ticket created a paper trail that might have confused any subsequent investigation." Mrs. Pilbeam sank into a chair, clearly overwhelmed by the implications. "To think that someone used our business for such deception, creating false records, manipulating our documentation." Frank Lacey shifted uncomfortably. "I hope I haven't done anything wrong, carrying that bundle. If I'd known it wasn't legitimate—" "You couldn't have known, Mr. Lacey," Miss Marple assured him. "The deception was quite carefully planned. Tell me, when you collected this bundle from Much Benham, did you deal with the usual contact there?" "Well, that's just it, Miss Marple. Wasn't the usual fellow at all. Someone I'd never seen before. Said he was handling special arrangements for laundry that needed to go back to Pilbeam's. Urgent, like." "Very well spoken, gentleman he was. Knew all the right details about bundle numbers and such. Can you describe this person?" Frank concentrated, clearly making an effort to recall details. Medium height, well-dressed in a quiet way, had a manner about him like he was used to dealing with business matters. Wore gloves. I remember that particularly because he was very careful not to get the string dirty when he handed over the bundle. Inspector Slack was making rapid notes. "Gloves in September weather. I struck me as a bit odd at the time, but some gentlemen are particular about their hands." Miss Marple had moved to examine the window where the afternoon light revealed additional details on the disputed bundle slip. "Inspector, might you observe this ticket once more? I believe there may be fingerprint traces visible along the edges, areas where gloves might not have provided complete protection." "Good thinking, Miss Marple. We'll need to have this examined properly." The evidence was building. Systematically, someone had arranged for Inspector Godfrey to be in the laundry at a specific time, using false documentation. And a manufactured emergency, the same person had access to the distinctive string that Frank Lacey recognized and had been careful to wear gloves during the deception. "Mr. Lacey," Miss Marple continued, "this string you mentioned, the white cord with red thread that Mr. Danks recommended, is it commonly available?" "Oh no, Miss Marple. Special order item." "It is. Mr. Danks said he got it from a particular supplier in Reading. Very proud of it. He was said it was the sort of thing that marked quality work." "Reading again," Inspector Slack muttered. "Same destination, Inspector Godfrey. Mentioned in connection with the banknote scheme, as—" Frank Lacey prepared to leave, clearly relieved to have shared his information. Miss Marple reflected on the careful planning that had preceded the previous evening's tragedy. Someone had orchestrated not only the mechanical aspects of the murder, but also the circumstances that would bring victim and weapon together at precisely the right moment. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we're dealing with someone who understands not only the technical requirements of this crime, but also the importance of creating plausible explanations for unusual circumstances. A very clever killer indeed, Miss Marple, but perhaps not quite as clever as he believes himself to be. The web of evidence was tightening, and at its center sat one name that appeared with increasing frequency in every aspect of the investigation. Chapter 2. Had the switch tied back. The more detailed examination of the mangle's electrical controls revealed a level of premeditation that was both impressive in its ingenuity and chilling in its calculated precision. Miss Marple approached the mechanism with the methodical care of someone who had learned through long experience that the most significant evidence often lay in the smallest details. Under the improved lighting that Inspector Slack had arranged, the switch housing displayed clear signs of tampering that had been less obvious in the previous evening's harsh electric illumination. The metal surface bore traces of what appeared to be a dried adhesive substance, applied with sufficient care to hold the control lever firmly in the on position while appearing to casual observation to be in its normal state. Shellac, as we suspected, Miss Marple observed, touching the dried residue with the tip of her finger, applied while still liquid and allowed to harden, creating a firm bond that would hold the switch securely. Dr. Haydock, who had joined them for this more thorough investigation, examined the evidence with professional interest. Quite clever, really. The shellac would dry quickly and hold firmly, but could be removed later without leaving obvious traces to anyone not looking. Specifically for signs of tampering, Inspector Slack was documenting each discovery with meticulous care, and this thread we found yesterday, it was used in conjunction with the shellac. I believe so, Inspector. The thread would provide immediate security while the shellac dried, then serve as additional reinforcement to ensure the switch remained in position despite any vibrations from the operating machinery. Miss Marple had moved to examine the area beneath the control housing, where their previous search had revealed the fragment of white thread with its telltale shellac residue. The discovery of this additional evidence had provided crucial confirmation of the method used to ensure the mangle would operate at the precise moment required. The killer's timing had to be perfect, she continued, her voice taking on the thoughtful quality that those who knew her had learned to associate with the unraveling of particularly complex schemes. The waxed coin would drop when warmed by the iron. The current would flow, and the machinery would start, but only if the switch had been secured in the proper position. And Inspector Godfrey's watch stopped at 6:32, Dr. Haydock observed. That would be the moment of the attack. Indeed. The poor man had perhaps 2 minutes to realize what was happening before the mechanism completed its deadly work. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes. 2 minutes during which he might have called for help if he'd understood the danger. Miss Marple shook her head gently. I suspect the inspector was struck first. That flat, heavy bruise Dr. Haydock observed would have rendered him unconscious immediately. The strangulation by the mangle rollers was secondary, intended to obscure the true cause of death. This observation led them to examine the area around the mangle more carefully, searching for whatever implement might have been used to deliver that initial incapacitating blow. The room contained various tools and equipment necessary for the laundry business, but nothing that obviously suggested itself as a murder weapon. It was while conducting this search that Miss Marple noticed something that had previously escaped their attention. Inspector Godfrey's notebook, which had been removed from the scene the previous evening, had left a faint impression on the wooden surface where it had been lying. Inspector Slack, she called. Might you bring that magnifying glass here? Under magnification, the wooden surface revealed the ghost of whatever had been pressed against it, not just the texture of the notebook's cover, but the impression of something that had been placed between the pages. A banknote, Dr. Haydock observed, studying the rectangular impression. Pressed flat by the look of it. Precisely what Inspector Godfrey had come here to investigate. The poor man had discovered physical evidence of the banknote processing operation, an actual specimen that had been cleaned and pressed using Mrs. Pilbeam's equipment. The implications were sobering. Inspector Godfrey had not merely suspected the existence of the scheme. He had found concrete proof, making his elimination an urgent necessity for whoever was responsible. Inspector Slack examined the impression carefully. This note. It would have been evidence enough to make arrests. Very likely, Inspector. A processed banknote bearing traces of the chemicals and techniques used here would have provided definitive proof of the operation. And now it's disappeared, along with whatever other evidence Godfrey might have gathered. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The killer would have had to remove all such material after the murder was accomplished. Another indication of careful planning and thorough execution. Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Len Fosdyke, the electrician who maintained the various meters and electrical fittings throughout the village. He appeared at the laundry door with a slightly apologetic manner of someone who knows he's intruding but feels compelled to do so. Nonetheless, begging your pardon, he said, addressing Inspector Slack with respectful formalism. But I heard about the terrible accident and thought I should mention something that might be relevant. Please come in, Mr. Fosdyke, Miss Marple encouraged. We're very interested in anything you might have observed. Fosdyke entered with obvious reluctance, clearly uncomfortable with being questioned about official matters. Well, it's about the Mangle motor, you see. I was here yesterday afternoon doing routine maintenance on the electrical connections. Mrs. Pilbeam mentioned that the machine had been running a bit roughly lately. What time was this? Inspector Slack inquired. Around about 3 o'clock, Inspector. I oiled the motor bearings and tested the operation to make sure everything was running smooth. But here's the thing. When I finished, I definitely turned the switch off. Made sure of it, I did. Always do when I'm working with electrical equipment. Safety first. Always. This information caused both Miss Marple and Inspector Slack to exchange significant glances. If Fosdyke had indeed left the switch in the off position, then someone had deliberately turned it on and secured it there as part of their murderous preparation. You're absolutely certain about this, Mr. Fosdyke? Miss Marple asked gently. Positive, Miss Marple. It's a matter of professional habit, you understand. Never leave electrical equipment energized when you're not there to supervise it. Safety first, always. Did you mention this maintenance work to anyone? Fosdyke considered the question carefully. Well, Mrs. Pilbeam knew, of course, and I believe I mentioned it to Mr. Danks when I stopped by his shop for some electrical tape. He seemed quite interested in the technical details, asked several questions about how the motor operated and such. What sort of questions? Oh, about the timing mechanisms, the electrical load, how long the motor might run if left unattended. Said he was thinking of installing similar equipment in his own establishment and wanted to understand the operational requirements. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with an expression of grim satisfaction. Mr. Fosdyke, thank you for coming forward with this information. It may prove very significant indeed. As the electrician departed, clearly, relieved to have discharged what he saw as his civic duty, Miss Marple reflected on how each new piece of evidence contributed to the emerging picture of calculated murder disguised as accidental death. The timing becomes even more precise, she observed to Inspector Slack. The killer knew that the motor had been serviced and the switch turned off. They knew exactly what preparations would be necessary to ensure the machinery operated at the required moment. And they knew that Fosdyke's maintenance work would provide perfect cover for any signs of tampering with the electrical systems. Miss Marple adjusted her knitting bag and prepared to continue what was proving to be an increasingly complex investigation. The evidence was mounting steadily, but the final proof of guilt would require more than circumstantial details and suspicious coincidences. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe our next step should be to examine very carefully the question of alibis. Someone went to considerable trouble to establish their presence elsewhere at the crucial time." Chapter My Mind. 8 Alibi between 6 and 7. The systematic examination of alibis proved to be an exercise in both precision timing and careful corroboration. Inspector Slack had arranged to interview each potential suspect in turn, while Miss Marple observed with the quiet attention she habitually brought to such proceedings. The critical period, as they had established, was between 6 and 6:30 on the previous evening, the window during which the elaborate murder mechanism had been set in motion. Mrs. Ada Pilbeam was the first to provide her account, speaking with the careful precision of someone who understood the importance of accuracy in such grave matters. She sat in her own front room, hands folded neatly in her lap, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed the strain of the past 24 hours. "I left Inspector Godfrey examining the Monday callers at precisely 10 minutes past 6, she began. "The clock there on the mantel chimed the quarter hour just as I stepped out. I went directly to the post office. Miss Pike had sent word that there were telegrams requiring my attention." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "Telegrams? Mrs. Pilbeam?" "From my sister in Bournemouth. She's been poorly, and the doctor wanted to send word about her condition. Miss Pike keeps a record of all telegrams received. Inspector, you can verify the time easily enough." This detail proved significant when they subsequently interviewed Miss Nora Pike, the postmistress, whose meticulous record-keeping provided precise corroboration of Mrs. Pilbeam's whereabouts. "Mrs. Pilbeam arrived at 18 minutes past 6, Miss Pike confirmed, consulting her official logbook. "I remember particularly because we had 3 telegrams to sort through, and she was quite concerned about the news from Bournemouth. She remained here until 20 minutes past the hour. I noted the time because I was expecting the evening mail collection. The precision of these records eliminated Mrs. Pilbeam as a suspect for the critical period when the murder mechanism would have been activated. She had been in full view of the postmistress during the crucial minutes when the waxed shilling finally dropped and the deadly machinery began its work. Iris Pilbeam's alibi proved equally verifiable, though it involved the very person who was emerging as their primary suspect." She repeated her account of the visit to Danks's establishment with the nervous precision of someone who had rehearsed the details. Carefully in her own mind, "I arrived at Mr. Danks's shop at 10 minutes past 6, she explained. "He was waiting for me. He had mentioned earlier that he had the proper ribbon for Aunt's adding machine and would fit it that evening if convenient." "And how long did this repair take?" "Well, Mr. Danks was very particular about getting it just right. Said it was important to adjust the tension properly, or the figures wouldn't print clearly. He worked on it for nearly 20 minutes, explaining the mechanism as he went." "You remained in the shop throughout this time?" "Oh, yes, Miss Marple. Mr. Danks said it was educational for me to understand how such devices operated. Very thorough in his explanations, he was." When they subsequently interviewed Cyril Danks himself, his account matched Iris's testimony with suspicious precision. He received them in his well-appointed shop with the smooth courtesy that characterized all his professional dealings, though Miss Marple detected a slight tension beneath his affable manner. "Indeed. I was pleased to assist young Iris with the adding machine ribbon," he confirmed. "Such a bright girl, and so eager to learn about mechanical devices. I believe we completed the work at approximately 6:30. "You're certain of the timing?" "Quite certain, Inspector." I walked Iris to the door and remarked on what a pleasant evening it was. The church clock was chiming the half hour as we said our farewells. Miss Marple observed that Danks provided these details with the fluency of someone who had given considerable thought to the exact sequence of events. And after Miss Iris departed, I returned to my shop to tidy up and secure the premises for the evening, then went to the back storeroom to fetch some collar stiffeners that a customer had requested for this morning's collection. The back storeroom? Yes, Miss Marple. I keep various supplies there, threads, haberdashery items, and such. It's quite separate from the main shop area. Inspector Slack made careful notes. How long would you estimate you remained in this storeroom? Perhaps 10 minutes, Inspector. I had to locate the particular type of stiffeners the customer required. They're a special quality item that I keep in a separate container. The timing was suspiciously convenient. If Danks had indeed been in his back storeroom from 6:30 until nearly 7, he could not have been observed by anyone in the main street during the critical period when Inspector Godfrey met his death. The interview with Len Fosdyke provided a different sort of alibi, one that relied on the testimony of an unusual witness. The electrician explained his whereabouts with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to keeping accurate records of his work activities. I was at Mrs. Ransom's cottage working on her wireless set, he explained. The valve needed replacing, and she'd been having trouble with reception for several days. What time did you arrive there? Just past 6, Inspector. I remember because Mrs. Ransom commented that she'd nearly given up expecting me for the day. Miss Marple looked up with interest. Mrs. Ransom would be able to confirm this. Fost smiled slightly. Well, Mrs. Ransom is a bit deaf, Miss Marple, but her parrots have excellent hearing. Bird said, "Good evening, Len." Clear as anything when I walked in. Always does. Regular as clockwork. This detail, while unusual, would be easily verified. Mrs. Ransom's parrot was well known throughout the village for its reliable vocal habits and precise timing. Finally, Frank Lacey provided his own account of the evening's activities. The quiet carrier explained that after delivering the mysterious bundle to Pillbeams at 5 minutes past 6, he had proceeded directly to the Hare and Hounds public house. Set my empty barrow in the usual spot at 25 minutes past 6, he reported. Landlord will confirm it. He always comments when the barrow's properly positioned and not blocking the entrance. Each alibi, taken individually, appeared solid and corroborated. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the very precision with which these accounts were provided. In her experience, genuine alibis often contained small inconsistencies and uncertainties that spoke to their authenticity, the mechanical precision with which each person could account for their movements suggested a level of preparation that seemed excessive for ordinary circumstances. Inspector, she said thoughtfully as they concluded the interviews, I find myself struck by how remarkably well documented everyone's movements were during this particular hour, almost as though several people had made special efforts to ensure their activities would be clearly remembered. Slack nodded grimly, particularly Mr. Danks's convenient retreat to his back storeroom, where no one could observe his actual activities. Indeed. And the timing of Iris's errand, which provided him with a witness to establish his presence in the shop until precisely the moment when he claimed to withdraw from public view. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone had orchestrated not only the mechanical aspects of the murder, but also the social circumstances that would provide apparent alibis for the crucial period. The question now was whether the evidence would prove sufficient to penetrate this carefully constructed deception. What's our next step, Miss Marple? I believe, Inspector, it's time to examine the physical evidence one more time. Sometimes the smallest details can illuminate the largest deceptions. Chapter C. 9 Green on the Roller. Felts. The return to the physical evidence proved to be the key that unlocked the final mysteries of Inspector Godfrey's murder. Miss Marple approached. The silent mangle with the careful attention of someone who understood that the most crucial revelations often lay in details so minute as to escape casual observation. The morning light streaming through the laundry windows provided illumination that revealed subtleties invisible under artificial lighting. She moistened the tip of her finger with delicate precision and touched it gently to the surface of the roller. When she examined her fingertip, a faint greenish residue was visible, barely perceptible, but unmistakably present. "Inspector Slack," she called softly, "might you observe this?" Slack approached and examined the trace of green on Miss Marple's finger with growing excitement. More of the banknote ink? Indeed. And if we consider the implications... Miss Marple moved to examine Inspector Godfrey's notebook, which had been returned to the scene for their investigation. She opened it carefully, revealing pages of meticulous notes in the inspector's precise handwriting. Here, I believe, is what the poor man discovered. One page bore a distinct rectangular impression, the ghost image of a banknote, that had been pressed between the leaves of the notebook. While still slightly damp from processing, the outline was faint but unmistakable, showing the exact size and proportions of legal tender. He found a specimen, Dr. Haydock observed, joining their examination. Physical proof of the laundering operation. More than that, Miss Marple continued, studying the impression under her magnifying glass. This shows the complete process. The notes were washed in bluing solution to remove stains and markings, then pressed flat in the mangle to eliminate wrinkles and restore their crisp appearance. The green ink traces on the roller felts represent the accumulated residue from multiple processing sessions. Inspector Slack was making rapid notes. So someone has been running quite an extensive operation through Mrs. Pilbeam's equipment. Precisely. And Inspector Godfrey had discovered not only the method, but concrete evidence of its execution. This would have been quite sufficient to justify arrests and prosecutions. Miss Marple closed the notebook thoughtfully. The poor man must have realized the significance of what he had found. Perhaps he even confronted his killer with the evidence, which made his elimination absolutely necessary, Slack concluded grimly. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who appeared at the laundry door with the determined air of someone who had been excluded from developments quite long enough. She surveyed the scene of investigation with obvious curiosity. "Jane, dear," she announced, "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday afternoon about people who live by small economies and notice things that others might overlook." Miss Marple looked up with interest. "Indeed, Dolly." "Well, it occurred to me that we might have been approaching the question from the wrong direction. Instead of asking who would notice damaged currency, perhaps we should ask who would have regular access to it. An excellent point. Please continue." Mrs. Bantry settled herself on the chair that Mrs. Pilbeam had occupied during earlier interviews. Someone in trade, obviously, but more specifically, someone whose business involves handling large numbers of small transactions. The sort of establishment where damaged notes might accumulate without attracting particular attention. "A draper shop," Inspector Slack observed, his tone growing thoughtful. "Somewhere that processes dozens of small purchases daily, where worn or stained currency would be a regular occurrence." Exactly so. And if such a person had discovered a method for restoring damaged notes to acceptable condition, they could gradually replace their accumulated inferior currency with processed specimens, then pass the originals along to legitimate channels. Miss Marple nodded approvingly, while simultaneously creating a profitable sideline by offering similar services to others who had acquired damaged currency through various means. "The perfect crime, really," Mrs. Bantry continued, "hidden in plain sight within the normal operations of a respectable business." Their theoretical discussion was given sudden practical significance by the appearance of Miss Pike. the postmistress, who approached the laundry with obvious reluctance but evident determination. "Inspector Slack," she began without preamble, "I believe I should report something that may be relevant to your investigation." "Please, Miss Pike," Miss Marple encouraged. "We're most interested in anything you might have observed." "Well, it concerns those parcels to reading that we've been posting regularly over the past several weeks. I mentioned them briefly yesterday, but I've been thinking about the matter more carefully." "What sort of parcels?" "Flat packages, always very carefully wrapped. The sender always paid exact postage and was most particular about insurance and delivery confirmation. Said they contained documents of considerable value." "Who was sending these packages?" Miss Pike hesitated briefly, then answered with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Danks, Inspector. He explained that he was handling some business correspondence for associates in Reading, commercial matters requiring special care and handling." The significance of this information was immediately apparent. If Danks had been posting processed banknotes to Confederates in Reading, it would explain both the destination that Inspector Godfrey had mentioned and the method by which the restored currency was being distributed. "How many such packages would you estimate, Miss Pike?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Perhaps 1 or 2 each week for the past month, always sent on different days, never following a regular pattern. Mr. Danks said his associates' requirements were somewhat unpredictable." Inspector Slack closed his notebook with an air of grim satisfaction. "I believe, Miss Pike, that you've provided the final piece of our puzzle." As the postmistress departed, clearly relieved to have discharged what she saw as her civic duty, Miss Marple reflected on how the various elements of the case had finally aligned into a coherent pattern. "The method becomes clear," she observed to her companions. "Mr. Danks would accumulate damaged currency through his normal business operations, then process it using Mrs. Pilbeam's equipment during periods when the laundry was unattended. The restored notes could then be gradually introduced into his shop's daily transactions, while the originals were posted to Confederates in Reading for broader distribution." "A very profitable arrangement," Mrs. Bantry observed, "and one that might have continued indefinitely if Inspector Godfrey hadn't begun investigating the marked currency trail." "Exactly. So once the inspector began focusing on local businesses and examining their cash-handling procedures, discovery was inevitable. Danks could not afford to let that investigation proceed." Inspector Slack stood and prepared to leave the scene where so much careful detective work had finally revealed the truth. "Right then. Time to have a final conversation with Mr. Cyril Danks. And this time we'll be armed with rather more than suspicions and circumstantial evidence." Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag with a quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen justice methodically assembled from careful observation and logical deduction. "I believe, Inspector, that you will find Mr. Danks less prepared for this interview than he was for the previous ones. The truth, as it so often did, had emerged through patient attention to the smallest details and most commonplace circumstances. What remained was the considerably less pleasant task of confronting a clever killer with the evidence of his crimes." Chapter 10. Laundry, Coin, Wax, and the Roller That Waited. The final confrontation took place in the very room where Inspector Godfrey had met his carefully orchestrated end. Miss Marple had suggested this setting with her customary quiet insistence, believing that the physical evidence should speak alongside their accumulated testimony. Inspector Slack had assembled the principal figures in the case: Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Pilbeam with her niece Iris, and finally Cyril Danks himself. Danks entered the laundry with his usual smooth confidence, though Miss Marple detected a certain weariness beneath his affable exterior. He surveyed the assembled group with the practiced eye of a businessman assessing a potentially difficult negotiation. "Inspector Slack," he began cordially, I do hope this won't take long. I have customers expecting deliveries this afternoon. I'm afraid your delivery schedule may require some adjustment, Mr. Danks. Slack replied grimly. We need to discuss your activities of yesterday evening, and indeed, your business operations over the past several weeks. Miss Marple stepped forward with the gentle authority that those who knew her had learned to respect. Perhaps, Mr. Danks, you would be interested to understand exactly how Inspector Godfrey met his death. A tragic accident. Surely, Danks replied, though his eyes had begun to show the first signs of genuine concern. Most unfortunate for everyone concerned. Oh, I think we can demonstrate that it was rather more than an accident, Miss Marple continued, moving to the silent Mangle. You see, Inspector Godfrey was murdered by means of a most ingenious mechanism, one that required considerable advanced preparation and detailed knowledge of this equipment. She indicated the prepayment meter mounted on the wall. It began with this waxed shilling, wedged in the coin slot with paraffin to delay its fall. The timing was controlled by that hot iron, left burning on the board to warm the wall and eventually soften the wax. Danks's expression had grown notably more guarded. I'm not sure I follow your reasoning, Miss Marple. The safety bar was defeated with one of your own collar stiffeners, slicked with starch and wedged beneath the mechanism. The electrical switch was secured in the on position with your white mercer's thread and a dab of shellac. Inspector Slack produced the evidence they had collected, laying each item out methodically on the counter. We found traces of all these materials. Mr. Danks, including fibers from that distinctive thread you recommended to Frank Lacey for his delivery bundles. The timing had to be precise, Miss Marple continued. Inspector Godfrey needed to be alone in this room at exactly the moment when the waxed coin finally dropped and the machinery activated. That required the false bundle that Frank delivered, complete with forged documentation, bearing traces of the same green ink that appears on your fingers when handling processed banknotes. Danks had gone notably pale, but his voice remained steady. This is almost interesting speculation, but hardly constitutes evidence of wrongdoing. Oh, but there's more, Miss Marple said gently. You see, Inspector Godfrey had discovered your banknote processing operation. He found physical evidence, a specimen that had been washed in bluing solution and pressed flat in this very mangle. The green ink residue on the roller felt tells quite a complete story. Dr. Haydock stepped forward. We also have testimony about those regular parcels you've been posting to Reading. Mr. Danks, flat packages containing what you claimed were business documents. The method was quite clever, Miss Marple acknowledged. Damaged currency accumulated through your shop's normal operations could be restored using Mrs. Pilbeam's equipment, then gradually reintroduced into circulation, while the originals were distributed through your reading associates. Danks's composure was beginning to crack. Under the weight of accumulated evidence, even if such activities had taken place, there's no proof that I was responsible for the inspector's death. But there is, Inspector Slack interjected. You arranged for Iris to require assistance with her aunt's adding machine at precisely the time needed to establish your presence in the shop. Then you claimed to withdraw to your back storeroom, conveniently out of sight, during the crucial minutes when Inspector Godfrey was being murdered. The ribbon replacement was genuine enough, Miss Marple observed. Young Iris can confirm that you did indeed repair the adding machine, but that errand served a double purpose, providing you with a witness until the exact moment when you needed to disappear from public view. Iris herself looked stricken as she realized how she had been manipulated. Mr. Danks, surely. You didn't. You couldn't have. Danks's mask of affability finally slipped. Entirely. The man was going to ruin everything, he said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of desperate justification. Years of careful work, a profitable arrangement that harmed no one of consequence. and he stumbled into it like some meddling amateur. "So you decided to eliminate him," Inspector Slack stated flatly. "I meant only to frighten him off," Danks protested, though his words lacked conviction. The mechanism was supposed to be a warning, show him how dangerous it could be to pry into matters that didn't concern him. Miss Marple regarded him with the sort of gentle disappointment she might reserve for a promising student who had failed to live up to expectations. The preparation was far too elaborate for a mere warning. Mr. Danks, the waxed coin, the disabled safety mechanisms, the secured switch. These were the tools of premeditated murder. Mrs. Pilbeam had been listening to this exchange with growing horror. "To think you used our honest equipment for such wickedness," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "And involved my niece in your schemes," she added, looking protectively at Iris, who was still struggling to comprehend the full extent of her manipulation. Inspector Slack moved forward with official authority. "Cyril Danks, I am arresting you for the murder of Inspector Reginald Godfrey and for operating an illegal currency processing scheme. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Slack led the defeated Draper away. Danks made one final attempt to justify his actions. "It was all going so perfectly," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine bewilderment. "Such careful planning, such precise execution. How could it have gone so wrong?" "Machinery is very obedient, Mr. Danks," Miss Marple replied quietly. "It does exactly what it was set to do. Nothing more and nothing less. The same cannot be said of human nature, which tends to leave traces that the most careful planning cannot entirely eliminate." After the official party had departed, Mrs. Bantry remained behind with Miss Marple in the now quiet laundry. She regarded the silent mangle with obvious distaste. "Horrid thing," she declared, with characteristic directness. Miss Marple folded her knitting with the satisfied precision of someone who had seen justice properly served. "Machinery is very obedient, my dear. It waits and does exactly what it was set to do, which is rather more than can be said of most people." Outside, the September afternoon was settling into the peaceful routines of St. Mary Mead, where such dramatic interruptions of village tranquility were fortunately rare. The case was closed, the truth revealed, and justice would follow its appointed course. In the end, it had been the smallest details: a trace of wax, a misplaced blue bag, a fragment of thread that had unraveled Cyril Danks's elaborate scheme. Miss Marple reflected, as she often did, on how the most carefully planned crimes invariably contain the seeds of their own detection. The human element, she knew, was always the weakest link in any criminal scheme, no matter how mechanically perfect it might appear to be.